And we are seeing ICE presence here in Northeast Florida this week.
Right. Agents were spotted running joint operations with FHP throughout our area.
Florida, they're trying to get their hands on your money.
Yeah, so the FBI is warning, don't fall for it. As News4Jax reporter Aaron Farrar tells us, these scammers are using threats.
By 8:10 a.m., the conference table inside the FBI's New York field office was already buried under gold cufflinks, burner phones, customs manifests, and one leather ledger swollen from being pulled out of wet concrete dust. An agent had placed a yellow evidence tent beside the page that mattered most. It listed truck numbers, election fundraiser dates, and 3 words underlined twice in blue ink: clear through Albany. 4 hours earlier, at 4:03 a.m., the target had looked harmless. A refrigerated produce warehouse on the Brooklyn waterfront, forklifts asleep, harbor wind pushing plastic wrap across the loading dock, sodium lights humming over stacked pallets of imported citrus. Then the breach team blew the side service lock, crossed the cold room, and opened a maintenance corridor hidden behind shelving marked for damaged freight. The corridor led to an office no shipping inspector had ever seen on a floor plan. Inside were currency counters, sealed hard drives, county contract folders, and a wall map stretching from New York to 15 other states, with 11 international lanes marked in grease pencil from the Caribbean, Europe, and the Gulf. Beneath that map sat binders for trucking brokers, labor vendors, port handlers, and real estate entities that should not have belonged to the same business family. But they did. This was not a smuggling outfit renting storage space. It was a supply chain syndicate nested inside legitimate commerce, protected by officials, brokers, and intermediaries who understood that the fastest way to move dirty money and dirty cargo through America is to make it look like routine distribution. Before the sun cleared Lower Manhattan, agents would raid offices, homes, depots, and shell company addresses in 16 states. By the end of the day, 30 kingpins and 87 total defendants would be in custody. But the warehouse was where the illusion ended. The first break had nothing glamorous about it. It began with a damaged pallet and a truck driver who got impatient. On February 6, 2025, inspectors at a commercial freight yard in Elizabeth, New Jersey, pulled aside a refrigerated trailer after the driver insisted on bypassing a secondary weigh check tied to paperwork discrepancies. The cargo manifest described wholesale seafood bound for restaurant distributors in Queens and Philadelphia. The pallet counts matched. The temperatures did not. One inner bay was running warmer than the rest. And tucked behind the listed cargo was a sealed crate containing counterfeit customs tags, payroll envelopes, and a stack of access badges tied to 3 different logistics firms. The driver, Michael Sorrenti, was supposed to be a local contract hauler. His phone said otherwise. It held recurring contacts with a waterfront broker in Brooklyn, a county procurement aide in upstate New York, and an event planner in Miami who had no visible connection to freight. That triggered a quiet joint review by FBI New York, HSI Newark, and IRSCI. Within 2 weeks, analysts matched Sorrenti's route logs to a pattern already bothering Treasury. Small freight firms with ordinary names kept appearing around suspicious transfers, port storage fees, last-mile delivery retainers, labor staffing invoices, emergency infrastructure reimbursements, and campaign-adjacent consulting payments. No single transfer looked catastrophic. Together they formed a payment lattice. Then a second anomaly surfaced in Albany. A state contract for refrigeration maintenance on publicly funded food distribution sites had been amended 3 times in 90 days. The vendor, ostensibly legitimate, shared a mailing trail with one of the freight firms from the New Jersey stop. From there, subpoenas opened vendor trees opened shell accounts, and shell accounts opened a corridor. That is when investigators stopped treating the case like cargo fraud. They started treating it like a protected supply system, one that moved illicit proceeds, contraband, influence, and selective government access along the same routes as ordinary American commerce. The more agents mapped, the less the organization resembled a conventional criminal family, and the more it resembled a privately governed trade network. At the center sat New York, Brooklyn piers, Hunts Point distribution lanes, warehouse space in Queens and Staten Island, legal offices in Midtown, trucking brokers in Newark. But the structure did not stop at the city. It ran through 16 states with different functions assigned to each region. New York handled coordination and political cover. New Jersey and Pennsylvania handled portside transfer and warehouse buffering. Florida ran shell hospitality and offshore receipt points. Georgia and North Carolina moved freight under agricultural cover. Illinois and Ohio handled inland relay storage. Texas and California absorbed procurement laundering through real estate and import brokers. Virginia, Maryland, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Tennessee, and Michigan carried secondary accounts, nominee businesses, and contract intermediaries. 42 shell companies formed the visible skin: Alder Basin Logistics, Penn Harbor Cold Chain, East Line Civic Procurement, Verity Workforce Solutions, Atlantic Meridian Imports, Hudson Event Strategies. Each performed a public-facing service. Each also served the syndicate. Some washed money, some disguised ownership, some moved goods, some placed loyal labor inside yards, depots, city contractors, and bonded facilities. The financial picture explained the reach. Treasury ultimately traced $980 million in criminal proceeds through the network, a blend of cargo theft revenue, procurement kickbacks, extortion payments, illegal gambling streams, labor coercion, and offshore laundering. And the money moved through consulting retainers, trucking invoices, emergency supply contracts, public event spending, security agreements, and real estate closings. It did not flow like gang cash. It flowed like business. Then the political layer surfaced. A city council fixer in Queens steered sanitation subcontracts. A union-connected dispatcher influenced which carriers got sensitive routes. A state procurement aide in Albany padded cold chain amendments that redirected public money into friendly vendors. A waterfront compliance consultant warned the group when federal inspections intensified. One congressional fundraiser, never charged in the first wave, appeared repeatedly in calendars tied to donation bundling and post-contract social events. This was bigger than corruption inside one office or one port. And it was a political criminal nexus attached to a multi-state supply chain where the syndicate did not merely bribe officials for protection. It used official process to reorganize routes, contracts, and risk. And once investigators understood that, the question shifted. Not who was skimming from the system, who was helping govern it from inside. The mechanism was disciplined because every part of it borrowed cover from a legitimate sector. A shipment entered through port infrastructure, rail yards, or inland trucking hubs. A broker touched the paperwork. A staffing firm supplied labor. A warehouse logged storage. A public contractor billed emergency handling or refrigeration support. A second-tier carrier moved the load across state lines. Somewhere in that chain, contraband, stolen freight, illicit cash, and/or politically protected inventory could be inserted, diverted, relabeled, or monetized without needing a gun on the loading dock. What looked like distribution was actually concealment. The network ran on separation. No single truck driver saw the books. No single procurement aide knew the offshore accounts. No single shell company director understood the state-level political favors behind the route approvals. But the command layer did. It linked transportation corridors to bribery channels to public contracts, and public contracts to laundering exits overseas. Those exits mattered. 11 international routes were dismantled in the final operation, stretching through Panama, the Dominican Republic, Colombia, the Netherlands, Cyprus, Malta, the UAE, and 2 Caribbean free-port transfer lanes. And some routes sent money out. Some returned it as investment capital. Some handled luxury goods, counterfeit documentation, or nominee ownership papers that re-entered the United States through clean-looking business vehicles. The syndicate also invested in resilience. When a port grew hot, movement shifted to trucking. When trucking drew scrutiny, warehouse dwell time increased, and ownership changed on paper. When financial institutions asked questions, accounts rotated through smaller processors, real estate escrow, or campaign-adjacent vendors. The organization was not built like a street crew. It was built like a company with contingency plans. That is what made the investigation so difficult. Agents were not chasing one hidden compartment or one payoff envelope. Now, they were chasing a system that understood logistics better than many of the people paid to regulate it. The public face of the syndicate was Victor Dane, 58, a polished shipping magnate who chaired charity dinners and spoke fluently about infrastructure resilience. According to the indictment, he was also the central broker between freight power, political access, and criminal revenue. Beneath him sat Elena Marchetti, 44, nominally head of East Line Civic Procurement. Her role was not muscle. It was paperwork. She shaped bid language, amendment timing, and vendor layering so public contracts could absorb private theft without looking broken. Gabriel Soto, 39, controlled the interstate trucking lattice. He knew which depots were loyal, which dispatchers could be bought, and which routes could carry sensitive loads with minimal friction. If Victor Dane was strategy, Soto was movement. Then there was Harold Venn, 63, a retired compliance lawyer whose real value was respectability. He advised shell companies on disclosure forms, coached proxies through ownership questions, and translated criminal intent into language that survived first-pass audits. Around them moved accountants, labor brokers, union intermediaries, campaign fundraisers, customs contacts, and warehouse managers. But those four formed the spine. Power, paperwork, movement, legitimacy. That was how the syndicate survived in plain sight. Operation Iron Meridian began at 3:48 a.m. on November 14, 2025, from command centers in New York, Newark, Atlanta, Chicago, Dallas, and Miami, with federal liaison cells feeding synchronized actions across 16 states. FBI New York led the strike. A DOJ organized the charging sequence. HSI, IRSCI, ATF, DEA financial support teams, U.S. Marshals, and state investigative units operated under compartmented timing rules to limit leaks. The first move was financial isolation. At 3:55, Treasury initiated freezes on 24 primary accounts, while parallel orders moved against brokerage holdings, escrow reserves, and property liens tied to syndicate-controlled entities. At 4:01, digital teams entered 2 Midtown legal suites and a Long Island accounting office to image servers before any emergency destruction protocol could fire. At 4:03, the Brooklyn warehouse breach team entered the waterfront site that anchored the New York hub. 6 minutes later, Newark agents hit a bonded storage yard. Chicago teams moved on an inland transfer facility by 4:15. In Atlanta, a staffing office doubling as a relay node was sealed before sunrise. Then the operational picture widened. Simultaneously, arrest teams hit residences in Westchester, Staten Island, Hoboken, Philadelphia, Coral Gables, Buckhead, Dallas, and Orange County. Trucks already under surveillance were stopped in Ohio and Tennessee. A cold storage facility in North Carolina yielded route binders, burner phones, and asset ledgers. In Maryland, prosecutors executed warrants on a contracting consultant whose calendar linked state officials to shell vendors. In Connecticut, a transport office produced sealed envelopes of cash matched to political fundraiser dates. The first wave looked devastating. Senior figures were down, accounts were frozen, warehouses were locked, servers were imaged. But that was only the beginning. At 5:07, the agents exploiting Elena Marchetti's tablet uncovered an emergency continuity file labeled Autumn Bridge. It contained substitute vendor lists, second-line dispatch codes, and travel schedules for 3 leaders not included in the initial New York target set. One was boarding a charter in South Florida. Another had crossed into Nevada the night before. A third was in a hotel outside Albany with sealed contract binders and a satellite phone. The operation adapted in real time. Follow-on warrants were approved before 7 a.m. Federal air assets tracked the Florida charter movement. Nevada teams hit a nominee office tied to Western escrow laundering. Albany investigators seized procurement files before staff reporting time. By the end of the first day, 30 kingpins had been captured across states, 87 total arrests had been logged, 42 shell companies were under enforcement review, 11 international routes had been disrupted, and $320 million in assets had been frozen. Remember that scale? Not because of the headline, because coordinated operations that large are rarely built against improvisation. They are built against systems. The evidence inventory confirmed that this had been a governing structure, not a loose alliance. Agents seized 31 route ledgers, 67 encrypted devices, 118 bank and escrow packets, contract amendment folders, dispatch logs, campaign calendars, beneficial owner charts, and internal message chains explaining how freight, politics, and money intersected. Some records tracked ordinary trucking movement. Others tracked protected loads, contract timing, inspection pressure, yes, and what one note described as friendly windows. Treasury and IRSCI reconstructed $980 million in criminal proceeds across the broader network. They also traced $320 million in assets frozen or restrained during the takedown. Real estate, cash reserves, brokerage accounts, vehicle fleets, luxury goods, warehouse holdings, and offshore-linked positions awaiting legal seizure. The 42 shell companies mattered because they showed method. Each had a reason to exist. None existed alone. Together, they created a marketplace where crime could rent legitimacy, and legitimacy could invoice crime back as commerce. That kind of evidence does more than convict people. It explains how an enterprise became durable enough to influence routes, contracts, and official behavior across half the country. The damage did not end with money. Eli Porter, a owner of a small refrigerated trucking company in New Jersey, spent a year losing bids he could never understand. Every time his firm came close to a major distribution contract, a lower bidder with stronger political ties surfaced from nowhere. Federal agents later told him some of those competitors were syndicate shells, designed not just to profit, but to control which honest carriers never got access. In upstate New York, warehouse worker Rosa Medina said she had seen drivers vanish from schedules after asking why loads were being resealed at night. She kept working because her family needed the paycheck. That is how systems like this hold, not only through corruption from the top, but through dependence below. When a syndicate bends supply chains and politics together, the victims are not just targets of violence. They are businesses priced out, workers silenced, cities overcharged, and public trust drained by transactions that looked routine until federal agents pulled the records into one frame. By spring 2026, federal prosecutors had assembled a sprawling racketeering case built on conspiracy, bribery, money laundering, wire fraud, cargo theft, extortion, labor exploitation, and honest services counts. Additional public corruption referrals moved through parallel grand jury review. State agencies reopened procurement files. Ports audited access controls. Transportation boards re-examined carrier licensing. Campaign finance records were subpoenaed far beyond the first arrest wave. The takedown had shattered the core. It had not exhausted the fallout, because this case was never just about kingpins moving contraband through warehouses. It was about what happens when criminal enterprise learns to wear the same clothes as logistics management and civic influence. The syndicate did not survive because it was ferocious. It survived because it was administratively fluent. It understood route density, vendor fragmentation, public procurement fatigue, and the transactional culture around political access. It knew that if dirty money passes through enough legitimate hands, every hand can claim to have touched only a harmless piece. That is why the numbers matter. 30 kingpins arrested, 87 total arrests, $980 million in criminal proceeds traced, 16 states involved in the coordinated operation, 11 international routes dismantled, 42 shell companies exposed, $320 million in assets frozen. Those figures define the scope of enforcement. They do not erase the blueprint. On one drive recovered from the Brooklyn warehouse, Agents found draft restructuring memos for replacement firms in 2 states not included in the initial strike narrative, plus contingency notes referencing municipal continuity relationships and secondary Western lanes. The language was dry, almost corporate. That is what made it dangerous. The organization had already imagined surviving its own exposure. So the final warning is straightforward. America's supply chains do not become criminal because every driver, clerk, contractor, or official is corrupt. They become vulnerable when complex systems reward speed, fragmentation, and plausible deniability. That is the space where syndicates thrive, between the invoice and the inspection. Yes, between the fundraiser and the contract, between the warehouse floor and the policy office. New York was the command center in this case. It was not the only place the model could work. That is what federal agents broke apart in Iron Meridian. Not just a network of men, a method. And methods, if institutions fail to learn from them, tend to return under new names, new shell companies, and cleaner suits.